In this video we will look at some of the Net triads, some of those prototypical triads that make up nets. Here we have 3 examples, and how conditional dependence works in each of these triads. So let's start with the triad of a common cause, which is what we saw in the previous video. So we're not going to spend too much time on this, but what we said about this, and the example again would be that there's a cause, for example a cavity, that causes pain and the dentist tool to catch. So one cause has 2 effects. A higher probability of cavity, or the existence of a cavity, causes a higher probability of each of these 2 variables. And we said, and we saw this in the previous video, that these 2 variables are not independent if we know nothing about cavity, which makes sense because if somebody is in pain, there's a high probability of the dentist tool catching, and this is a symmetric relationship. So if a dentist tool is catching, there's a high probability that they're in pain. But they are independent if we know cavity. So they're conditionally dependent on this variable here, meaning that if we know that the person has a cavity, in this case everything about the probability of pain and catch is determined only by the fact that the person has or doesn't have a cavity. The cavity explains away the dependence between these variables, and therefore they're conditionally dependent, conditioned on cavity. So a common cause situation results in 2 variables that are conditionally dependent, but they're conditionally dependent given we know a cavity, and you can refer to the previous video to get an intuition for this. Similarly, we have the situation of a chain, or a single step Markov chain, and here the example could be that there's rain, and rain causes traffic, and traffic causes me to be late. So in this case, if we know that there's rain, that increases the probability of traffic, and if there's traffic, it increases the probability of me being late, and then it's basically the same situation. So these 2 variables are not independent, they are actually dependent variables. Knowing that there's rain tells me something about the probability of me being late, and knowing that I'm late tells me something about the probability of there being rain, because they are connected through this variable. But again, as in the previous example, if I know that there was or wasn't traffic, then these 2 variables again become conditionally independent, conditioned on this traffic variable. So everything I know about rain affecting me being late, I know through the traffic. So if I know that it rained, and I know nothing about traffic, that increases the probability of me being late. But if I know that there was traffic, then knowing that it rained does not affect my probability of being late, because the probability is already biased in one way or another, because I'm in this particular slice of the Darn probability distribution that is the traffic slice. And now let's look at the 3rd example, which is, I'm going to erase this to make more room here. And the 3rd example is the kind of confusing one, which is the common cause example. In this case, actually the relationship is flipped, because we say that these 2 variables are independent, but they are conditionally dependent on knowing this variable. So here we have the opposite situation. And let's take an example here as well. So here we use the example from the earthquake and the burglar. So there could be an earthquake and there could be a burglar, and each of those influences the conditional probability of the fire alarm going off. And now we have the situation that if there was no fire alarm and we don't know anything about the fire alarm, there's no relationship between there being an earthquake or burglary in our model. So these 2 variables are independent if we don't know anything about the alarm, because the probability of a burglar being in my house is not influenced on whether I know that there was an earthquake or there wasn't an earthquake, unless burglars don't go out on earthquakes, but I'm going to ignore this for a moment. And the other way around is the same. Knowing that there's a burglar at my house will not tell me anything about the probability of there being an earthquake under this model. But here, if I know that there was an alarm, the relationship between these probabilities is now changing. Because if I know there was an alarm, and I know there was a burglary, then the probability that there was also an earthquake is now much lower, because the probability of the alarm is dependent on the probability of the burglary and the earthquake. And maybe the other way around is more intuitive. So knowing that there's an alarm, and now I know that there was an earthquake, it reduces my probability that I think that there's a burglar at my house, because I have an explanation for the alarm that is not the burglar. So here we have the situation where knowing the conditional variable actually creates or deletes the independence between these two variables. And next we'll see how this plays into what we can say about the sort of classic Bayesian filter. So here we have, again, I just put them together here, these three prototypical situations, the triads. And in this case, x and z are not independent, but they are conditionally independent on x. And here, these x, y, and z are independent, but they're not conditionally independent if we know x. And let's see how this plays out in our kind of classic robot control and evidence filtering situation, where we have a state. The state is the state probability is influenced by the belief or the state probability of the previous state and our control, and then it creates probabilistically some evidence. And this is how we do our filter. This goes on for the next step, etc. So let's look at some of these triads and see how it really makes sense, how these statements really make sense in this situation. And let's just look at the triad of single control and evidence. And this is, you see, this chain here is an example of this chain. And we can say that obviously our control, that we're controlling the robot, and then we collect evidence from the sensors, they're not independent. These two are related to each other probabilistically. But our claim here is that they're related to each other only through this belief state, or the state of the world. And if we know this belief state, then these two become conditionally dependent on this belief state. So we can sort of separate our control from our evidence by what we know about the belief state. However, if we look at the previous state, our control, and the new state, then our control is, if we don't know the new state, our control is independent of the previous state. So in this model, our control is not being influenced by the previous state, even though in reality it usually is. But in our model here, the control is independent of the previous state. But if we know the new state, then they're not conditionally dependent anymore. And knowing the new state and knowing our control will tell us something about the previous state, because both of them are influencing the same state. So if you think about this in a concrete example, if I'm like on the left side of the screen, and then I'm moving right, and suddenly I'm in the center of the screen. So my moving right has nothing to do with where I was before, in this model. But if I know that I'm in the center, if I have a high probability of being in the center, then knowing that I was on the left side gives me a probability of that I moved right. If I knew, for example, that I was on the right side, then this would influence, being on the center would influence my assumption that I moved left and not right. So these are just two examples of particular triads that we see in control and in this control and evidence network that we use a lot in robotics, and how the conditional independence prototypes really make sense within this model.